May 6, 1945. Late afternoon, a mountain road near the Austrian border, a few miles southwest of Berchtesgaden. 3 American paratroopers, Staff Sergeant William Bowen and Privates Harry Barker and McFarland Barneson, are driving a captured German fire engine down the highway, looking for diesel fuel to keep it running. The war in Europe is, for all practical purposes, over. Nobody has told the paratroopers exactly how over. And 17 miles from Berchtesgaden, at a blown bridge near a settlement called Hirschbickel, Sergeant Bowen starts across the wrecked foundation on foot. Something pokes him hard in the ribs in the dark. A voice gives him a command in German. He looks up into the barrel of a submachine gun. This is not how the story of a surrender is supposed to start. It's supposed to start with the beaten side raising a white flag to the victor. What actually happened on that mountain road is the reverse, and it says more about the state of the German army in the war's final week than almost any formal ceremony could. The 3 paratroopers spent the next several minutes trying, without much success, to explain to the soldier, holding the gun on them, that the war was effectively finished. He marched them to a nearby farmhouse instead. There, they asked to be taken to whoever was in charge, and Private Barneson, who spoke some German, is brought before the ranking officer on the scene. Lieutenant General Theodor Tolsdorff, commander of the German Elexsicherung Corps. And stories like this, the ones that don't make it into the documentaries because they're too strange or too small to fit the usual narrative of a surrender, are exactly what this channel exists to dig up. If you want the rest of this series, subscribe and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from and whether anyone in your family served in it. Tolsdorff was, by any measure, one of the more remarkable officers left in the German army at that point in the war. 35 years old, and wounded 11 times over 11 years of service, he had earned the Knight's Cross with oak leaves, swords, and diamonds, one of the highest and rarest combinations of decoration the Wehrmacht awarded, held by only a small handful of men in the entire war. Among his own troops, he'd picked up the nickname Toller Tolsdorff, roughly Mad Tolsdorff, for a battlefield recklessness with his men's lives and his own that had, by early May 1945, left his corps a shadow of what it had once been, scattered remnants of 3 Volksgrenadier divisions, and a mix of Wehrmacht, Luftwaffe, and SS stragglers, totaling somewhere around 2,200 men. Tolsdorff kept Sergeant Bowen as a hostage and sent the 2 privates back toward Berchtesgaden to arrange a formal surrender. On foot, at a run, back up one of the steepest mountain grades in the Bavarian Alps, because the fire engine they'd arrived in wouldn't restart. By the following morning, an American jeep column had made it to the bridge. A German colonel standing near the crossing with Sergeant Bowen greeted the arriving Americans in English with a line that has survived, verbatim, in the division's own official history. "Looks like we can all go home now." What followed wasn't quite the dignified ceremony either side might have pictured. Initial negotiations were handled by a captain, which Tolsdorff apparently felt was beneath his rank. It took the arrival of Colonel Robert Sink, and commanding the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, before formal terms were actually agreed to. The surrender of Tolsdorff's entire corps, effective at noon on May 8, 1945. And when Tolsdorff and his staff finally came down from the mountains to complete it, they arrived in a convoy of 31 vehicles loaded with personal baggage, cases of liquor, cigars, cigarettes, and by the account recorded at the time, a number of accompanying girlfriends who had traveled with them through the war's final collapse. It's an almost absurd image next to what most people picture when they think about the end of the Third Reich in the Bavarian Alps. But it's also exactly documented, down to the vehicle count, by the men who were there, and it's only the opening act of what the 101st Airborne actually found waiting for it around Berchtesgaden that week. What happened 3 days later, and when a far more senior German commander walked into American custody under very different circumstances, 3 days after Tolsdorff's convoy rolled down out of the mountains with its cases of liquor and its accompanying girlfriends, a very different kind of German officer walked into American hands near Saalfelden, Austria, on May 9, 1945. Generalfeldmarschall Albert Kesselring, Commander-in-Chief of German forces in the West, and one of the most senior field marshals, still holding a command anywhere in the collapsing Reich, surrendered his headquarters not to a general, not even to a colonel, but to an American major. There was no negotiation over vehicle counts or convoy dignity this time. Kesselring simply gave himself up and was taken from there to be presented to Major General Maxwell D. Taylor, commanding general of the 101st Airborne Division, at Berchtesgaden. What happened next is one of the stranger footnotes of the war's final week, precisely because of how ordinary and civil it was. And Taylor treated Kesselring with a level of courtesy that would raise eyebrows back home almost as soon as the photographs reached American newspapers. And Kesselring was allowed to keep his personal weapons and his field marshal's baton. Symbols of rank a defeated enemy commander doesn't typically retain in the custody of the army that just finished beating him. He was even permitted to travel, essentially unescorted, to visit his former Eastern Front headquarters at Zeltweg and Graz before formally entering captivity. Taylor then arranged rooms for Kesselring and his staff at a hotel in Berchtesgaden itself. If you're new to this channel, this is the kind of story we're built around. The small, human, well-documented moments of the war that don't survive in the popular version of history. Subscribe for the rest of the series, and if anyone in your family served, anywhere, any branch, any theater, tell us about it in the comments, along with where you're watching from. On May 10, 1945, a photographer captured Taylor and Kesselring together at Berchtesgaden, the American general and the German field marshal sitting across from each other and drinking tea. The image, along with others from the same encounter, made its way back to the United States and, in the words of the historical record surrounding it, created a genuine stir. In Americans who had spent years reading casualty lists and watching newsreels of the war in Europe were now looking at a photograph of their own general sharing tea with a man who only days earlier had commanded the forces they'd been fighting. It read, to many people at the time, like an uncomfortably genteel ending to a war that had cost so much to win. It's worth being precise here about what Kesselring actually was, because the courteous treatment photographed at Berchtesgaden sits at an odd angle next to what came later. 2 years after that tea was poured, a British military court in Venice tried Kesselring and found him guilty in connection with the killing of hundreds of Italian civilians during the German occupation of Italy. The Ardeatine Caves massacre among the charges most closely tied to his name. He was sentenced to death. The sentence was commuted to life imprisonment, and ill health won him an early release in 1952. The tea, the baton, the unescorted travel to old headquarters, none of that erased what a military tribunal would establish about his record a few years later. And the courtesy at Berchtesgaden was a snapshot of a specific moment between two professional soldiers at the exact hinge point of the war's end, not a verdict on the man. That contrast, Tolsdorff's undignified convoy full of stragglers and liquor cases, and Kesselring's almost diplomatic reception with the highest levels of American command, captures something real about what surrender actually looked like across a single week in Bavaria in May 1945. It wasn't one ceremony. It was dozens of separate and coordinated endings, playing out in farmhouses and mountain roads and hotel rooms, each one shaped entirely by who happened to be standing where and who happened to still be in a position to give any orders at all. And the photograph that caused the stir wasn't even supposed to exist. Taylor himself explained years later, in an interview recorded for American Heritage magazine, exactly how it happened. Army headquarters had approved a press conference with Kesselring at the hotel where he was being held, on the condition that no photographs would be taken. Kesselring sat at one end of a long table, the assembled press at the other. And someone in the room ignored the restriction and took a picture anyway, one that showed Kesselring flanked by Taylor and another American general, with a scatter of wine glasses and bottles visible in the frame, bottles that, by Taylor's account, actually belonged to the reporters seated further down the table, not to the Americans posing with a defeated field marshal. None of that context made it into print. And the photo ran in a London newspaper days later under a caption that needed no further explanation to do its damage. Another backslapping party with the Nazis. It went further than embarrassment. General Eisenhower's headquarters had a formal non-fraternization policy in place across the occupied zones that spring, and the incident triggered an actual Inspector General's investigation by 7th Army. The official finding, and preserved in the Army's own post-war historical record, concluded that Major General Maxwell Taylor, Brigadier General Gerald Higgins, and Brigadier General William Gilmore had engaged in contact with Field Marshal Kesselring, but had not fraternized with him, a careful legal distinction that let the incident close without further consequence for any of the officers involved. It's a small and dry bureaucratic sentence, but it's a remarkable one to have survived at all. proof that the war's end, even at the highest levels of American command, is being watched and second-guessed in real time by an army that hadn't yet decided how humane its victory was allowed to look, put next to each other, and the two surrenders this series has followed say something genuinely different from the tidy version of Germany surrendered that gets compressed into a single date on a timeline. Tolsdorff's corps came down out of the mountains as a chaotic remnant. Stragglers from 3 shattered divisions, 31 vehicles of personal baggage and liquor and girlfriends, a general who felt a captain wasn't a dignified enough officer to accept his surrender. Kesselring's surrender was almost the opposite. Composed, orderly, and conducted with enough courtesy that it needed an official army inquiry to establish it, hadn't crossed a line. Both men had commanded German forces, answering to the same collapsing high command. Neither surrender looked anything like the other, because by May 1945 there was no longer a single German army giving orders. There were officers, in different places, making different calls about how the war was going to end for them personally. As for what these men actually said, in their own later words, about the Americans who accepted their surrender, the honest record is thinner than a dramatic script would want it to be. Kesselring's own post-war memoir, published in English in 1954 as Kesselring, A Soldier's Record, is largely occupied with defending his wartime decisions rather than reflecting on the 101st Airborne specifically. Reviewers at the time noted its defensive tone. And 2 years after that surrender at Saalfelden, a British military tribunal in Venice would convict him in connection with the killing of hundreds of Italian civilians, a verdict that reframes everything about the courtesy photographed at that hotel in Berchtesgaden. Tolsdorff, for his part, has left behind mainly what the paratroopers who captured him recorded of that week: the fire engine, the hostage exchange, a German colonel's dry greeting at the bridge, rather than any reflective post-war account of his own about the men of the 101st. And what actually survives, checkable against the sources below rather than invented for a better line, is this: one German general's convoy that looked more like a retreating carnival than a surrender, one field marshal's tea service that nearly became an international incident, and an American division's own headquarters investigating its own officers within weeks of a war they'd just finished winning. That's a stranger, a more human ending than the clean version of victory usually gets credit for, and it happened in the same handful of mountain villages, in the same few days of May 1945, to men who a week earlier had still been enemies in the field.